Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me this morning to talk about coffee and tea in what is now Sri Lanka. And I was sort of watching you come in, trying to decide if we have an audience of coffee drinkers. I think so. Yes. Or do we have a few tea drinkers? Oh, more than I expected. Okay, so Sri Lanka, you know where it is. It's in the Indian Ocean. It's had actually both a long and interesting history of both coffee and tea production. So if I did the sort of quiz and asked you who you thought were the first Europeans that got there, you would all immediately write down, wouldn't you, the Portuguese. Because I've told you many times now, the Portuguese were the first out here, the first Europeans to land on Ceylon in the early 1500s. Why? Well, again, you know the answer to this, because they were trying to get control of the lucrative Indian Ocean trade routes, particularly, again, you like fill in the blank, the spice trade. All this was all about the spice trade. And at this time, Ceylon was a key producer of, do you know the answer to that one? Cinnamon, which was a really valuable commodity in the European markets. And so the Portuguese sought to dominate the island to secure access to the resources that the island was producing, but also to strengthen their trade network in Asia. And so when they were here, they built, we're not there yet, are we? They built several fortresses. And so during the colonial period, their colonial period, we might say the 16th and 17th centuries, this is an original entrance to the Portuguese-built fort. In Colombo, it's been partly demolished now. The British came and got rid of it. And this was constructed in the early 16th centuries. So they were serious. They were here, they wanted to trade, they wanted to dominate. And how do you dominate? You built forts and you build up your muscle. About 100 years later, again, I'm sure you know who came next. The Dutch came. They arrived on Ceylon to challenge the Portuguese control over the island. And of course, they wanted access to this cinnamon trade. Their involvement in all this was actually part of what was called the Dutch-Portuguese Wars that started in the early 1600s and lasted about 60 years. And this was in Asia. And I think I've said to you already, during this period, you know, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English were all fighting each other for dominance. These wars kept breaking out. And so when the Dutch East India Company wanted to replace the Portuguese as a dominant European power in the Indian Ocean, because the Portuguese had been holding that for a long time. And of course, Ceylon was a great place to get cinnamon. And so during the 17th century, when the Dutch got here, they expanded the cinnamon plantations and they forced the local workers, often under harsh conditions, to harvest the cinnamon, and they strictly controlled all trade. And the locals were actually barred from selling cinnamon independently. They really took over. And by the end of the 17th century, they also began to plant coffee. And this really was a business sense. It was a way to diversify their trade. Cinnamon did remain the most valuable crop to them, but the demand for coffee was now rising in Europe. So the Dutch had already successfully cultivated coffee in Java. which was their colony in Indonesia. And I was telling you in one of my previous talks about the coffee in Indonesia. And by 1699, they saw the potential in Ceylon's highlands, and they transplanted coffee plants from Java to Ceylon. And you know, as if you remember what I told you about Indonesia, they'd actually stolen those coffee plants to begin with. So interesting how these things are moving around. And coffee did grow well in Ceylon's climate. They began to export it to the European markets. And the Dutch interest did still actually, even though they were always, I suppose, experimenting with coffee. Is it going to work? Can we really make money out of it? But they did remain very much focused on cinnamon. So coffee didn't become a major crop under the Dutch. The plantations were quite small. Large-scale cultivation only began when the British arrived. In 1796, Britain took Ceylon from the Dutch, and this was during the Napoleonic Wars. And why did they do that? Well, they wanted to prevent it from falling into French hands. And the island was strategically important for controlling the Indian Ocean trade routes, as I said, and it had valuable resources. And not only did it have cinnamon, it had coffee now, but it was also very important for pearls. And then in 1815, Britain brought the whole island under British rule, and Ceylon became a British colony until independence in 1948. The British actually did see coffee as a valuable crop. By now, Europe was wanting more, and they started to invest in increasing the production. But it was this guy, George Bird, a Scottish army officer, who established the first successful large-scale coffee plantation near Kandy. And that was about 5 years later. So they were really sort of looking for ways to make it bigger. In the early 1820s, after being granted 80 hectares of land and a tax-free large loan by the colonial government, he set up this plantation. But at this time, actually, these people were coming over, but they weren't that many British people who really knew about how to run a coffee plantation, how to plant it, how to grow it, and all the rest that goes with it. So Bird was followed to Ceylon by this guy called Edward Barnes. He actually later became the governor of Ceylon as well. And a year later, after he was made governor, he set up his plantation. And his plantation is now part of the Royal Botanic Gardens, and this is just outside Kandy, which is quite away from where we're going. By 1827, coffee was beginning to be very profitable, and the British were focusing entirely almost on this. And many other plantations were started excuse me, as the British colonial administration increased production. And so what do you need to do when you're trying to grow something, you're trying to make a profit out of it? You need to make it easy for businesses to function. So the British started to invest in infrastructure. They started building roads, they built railways, and they developed the ports, especially Colombo. Excuse me, I'm going to have to cough again. And further expansion came when the British government started to sell land that they'd obtained from the kings to the British, and they brought in Tamil labour. Now, there must have been some agreement between the kings and the British to actually get this land. It was probably quite unequal. But then they brought Tamil labour in from India. And this is actually, when we get to Sri Lanka, you will notice it was this sort of move to bring the Tamil labour into Sri Lanka to work on the coffee plantations that's resulted in the ethnic makeup of Sri Lanka as it is now. So, as you know, the usual colonial story, the British were there, or whoever was there, to be honest, the British were there, that the local people were being pushed off their lands, and it did cause many people to be plunged into poverty. And this chap is very important in the story. He was very involved in all this, and he's often called the father of Ceylon planting, because he played a big role in transforming Ceylon's agricultural landscape during the 19th century. Why him? Well, he'd gained knowledge and valuable experience in Jamaica before he arrived in Ceylon in 1837. So he was able to use his knowledge about coffee growing that he'd brought with him, and he also experimented actually with growing cocoa using seeds from the Caribbean, where cocoa was all well established there. It's still being grown. This is a cocoa pod. Have you ever seen them? They're about the size of your hand. And it's still being grown there, and it's supposed to be really good chocolate. It's exported as single origin cocoa. And if you see that, it's supposed to be very good. I haven't tried any. I'm intending to when we get there. But back to coffee. So which began to be a boom. In the 1840s, they were getting the highest price in the London markets for the coffee from Ceylon. This guy had taken a second-hand copy of this book with him, The Coffee Planter of St. Domenico, and it's actually it became known as the Coffee Planter's Bible. And the person who wrote this talked all about how they cultivated coffee in Haiti. And it would really lay the foundations of how coffee was going to be sorted out, the plantations, the estate systems, as it was called. So during the mid-1800s, Sri Lanka's coffee production flourished, and by the 1870s it became one of the country's main exports, putting colonial Ceylon actually in the top coffee producing and exporting countries. And it also, while it was at it, developed a coffee drinking culture, complete with coffee K-Day, coffee kiosks. You can see one here now. And they started to spring up all over the place. And more planters were arriving from Britain. More land was wanted, so the colonial government actually now, they'd run out of the lands that they'd sort of got from the king. So what did they do? Well, they started to take thousands of acres of common and forest land and then sell that as well. You can imagine the locals weren't best thrilled about that. They sold it at 5 shillings an acre to would-be planters. And of course, many of the buyers were government servants who were working out there, including the governor himself, the army commander, the surveyor general, several judges. So you can see a bit sort of coffee plantations for the old boys network out there, certainly. And under the colonial government, a coffee mania began, similar to the gold rushes which took place in California and in Australia. If you remember, I talked to you about the Australian gold rush, although that does seem a lifetime away. Do you feel the same? And this caused many people to invest, amounting to around £5 million in the day, probably around 80 billion in today's currency. I'm talking about sterling pounds. it was being poured into coffee. And by 1848, there was around 600 estates which had taken over around 50,000 acres of land, which again you can see would be causing big problems for the local people who needed the land to grow food on. But in 1848, a financial crash in Europe ended the coffee mania. Several firms went bankrupt. Many planters actually went to Australia to take part in the gold rushes that were starting there. We know all about those. But the ones who did remain tried to revive their fortunes with coffee. And so after the crash, the coffee industry did eventually begin to get on its feet again. But about 20 years later, another problem affected coffee. It was in 1869 the coffee plantations were devastated by a fungal disease. This is coffee leaf rust, which not only affected Sri Lanka but other areas in Asia. And I think you might remember me talking about it affecting the Indonesian coffee plantations. For some reason, and I really don't know why, the planters nicknamed this Devastating Emily. I don't know who Emily was and what Emily had done while she was out there, but this was Devastating Emily. And by 1900, the production of coffee had fallen. Coffee was on its way out. And actually, today, the Sinhala expression used, kopi kale, originates from this period when coffee was the dominant crop in Ceylon. And it's actually become a synonym for very long ago. So what you might hear people say, oh, do you remember kopi kale when life was good? It means a very long time ago. So, what to do next? The next thing was to be, of course, tea. They had tea plants which they brought to Ceylon back in 1824 from the wild tea plants growing in India. And they had been planted, this is the Royal Botanic Gardens again, but for non-commercial purposes. It was just thought it was a good idea to try cultivating them. And they did grow successfully, which proved that the climate was suitable for growing tea. But about 20 years later, the British came up with a very interesting idea. They were worried, the British were worried, that the Chinese emperor might upset the Treaty of Nanking. The Treaty of Nanking after the First Opium War, and that was the treaty when the British got Hong Kong, if you remember that. It was a delicate peace treaty, and the British were worried that it wouldn't hold. There was 2 more opium wars after that. And so what they thought, Chinese might legalize opium production in China and break India's and therefore Britain's monopoly on selling opium to China in exchange for tea. I've told you that the British are mad about tea. The Chinese didn't want anything the British had, so the British had to pay for it with silver, which upset them. They didn't like parting with all their silver, so they set up the opium trade. Opium sales have been banned in China for many years, and so the British weren't actually selling opium to the direct to China. They were selling it to the smugglers on the coast of China. So it was a really big issue. And if the Chinese sort of got round that by legalising opium, it would be a disaster for the British. They would lose so much money. And an idea was pushed by this guy who's called Henry Hardinge. He was the governor of India at the time. And his idea actually took hold in the city of London. And this is what he wrote. In my opinion, by no means improbable that in a few years the government of Peking, by legalizing the cultivation of opium in China, where the soil has already proved equally well adapted with India to grow the plant, may deprive this government of one of its present chief sources of revenue. Under this view, I deem it most desirable to afford every encouragement to the cultivation of tea in India. In my opinion, the latter is likely in course of time to prove an equally prolific and more safe source of revenue to the state than that is now derived from the monopoly on opium. So you can see where he's going with this. And also, why use one word when you can use 10? Makes you sound more important, doesn't it? So, interesting idea. He actually thought the Himalayan mountain range in India resembled China's best tea growing regions, and they could replicate the quality of China's tea. But there was just one small problem to this plan. The British had no good quality tea plants. The wild tea plants weren't good enough. And also, to add to this, they had no real detailed knowledge of how to grow it and to process it, to be honest. But you know, the British, we never like small details like that stand in our way. What to do? Well, the ideas of Hardinge had taken hold in the East India Company. You can imagine all these men, because most of the men at this time seem to look like this, sitting around a big wooden table going, "Oh, that seems a very good idea. I wonder how we're going to do that. Why don't you go and discuss it with somebody, and then we'll have another meeting and see what we can do." And so the ideas had taken hold, and they did come up with a plan. And on May the 7th, 1848, this guy, Dr. John Forbes Royals, he was a botanist and an horticultural advisor to the East India Company, went to visit this chap, Robert Fortune. Has anybody heard of him? No, it's a bit of history that, yes, some people have. A bit of history that's really forgotten almost. And he went with a proposition. Would Fortune be willing to go to China in the employ of the East India Company as a tea hunter? He was simply to go there and steal the secrets of tea. He was to ship the tea seeds and plants to India that he'd managed to get out of China, and also get the knowledge of how to grow it. Now, I'll just add, I haven't got time to tell you about this. It's a fascinating story. It reads more like fiction than non-fiction, to be honest. He was Scottish. He was 6'2". Westerners weren't allowed out of the port areas in China, and he needed to go into the interior. So I say it again, he was Scottish, he was 6'2". What to do? Well, of course, he did employ 2 Chinese fixers, and one of them said to him, "You can't go looking like that. Somebody might spot you." And so he shaved his head. He complains that they used a blunt razor, the Chinese fixers, to shave his head. He shaved his head. They stuck a Chinese plait, a queue, on the back of his head. They bought him some big robes, some merchant robes that he wore. And in disguise, he went into the interior of China, and he was successful. He was successful in stealing the secrets of tea. And he was working on this between 1848 and 51. And these plants were planted in India when he sent them back, and they thrived. And then, of course, later in Ceylon. So this stolen plants, the knowledge that he brought with him. He managed to get some Chinese tea planters out as well, who were running the plantations in India. And so this stolen knowledge kick-started the tea industry first in India, and then they used those plants in Ceylon to kick-start it in Ceylon. And within 20 years after Fortune's theft, it was probably the biggest espionage event that's happened. 20 years later, China was cut out of the market because there was enough tea for the British coming out of India. And so in Ceylon, the tea trade was to supersede the coffee trade. And we all know, I think, how good Ceylon tea is. And added to all this, in terms of the main characters, was this chap. He was also from Scotland. Robert Fortune was Scottish as well. He's called James Taylor. He is now widely regarded as the father of Ceylon tea. He'd actually arrived on the island in 1852, and he'd actually arrived 17 years before the coffee blight. And when he arrived, he went to manage the Lully-Condra estate, a coffee plantation in the Kandy district. And this was, of course, before the coffee rust issue. Ceylon was still developing at this point into the world's largest coffee producer. But despite the success of the coffee, the owners of this estate told Taylor to experiment with tea. And it was really lucky timing, as the coffee rust disease was shortly to rear its head, and within 2 decades, coffee would almost be wiped out. And so 3 years before the coffee rust issue, Taylor collected tea seeds from the Royal Botanical Gardens. So these are the local ones from India, not the good stuff, and planted them along the roadsides of the estate. And within the next 12 months, the first small tea estate was born in, and I really like this, field number 7. And from that time, Taylor's experimentation with tea would make his name and that of the Lully-Condra estate. He would forever be associated with the birth of what would quickly become the world-famous brand Ceylon tea. In 1867, Taylor cleared 19 acres of forest and he planted his better Assam tea that he'd now got from India, the offspring of the tea plants that had been stolen from China. And in the first years, he learned how to nurture the seedlings so they grew into healthy, mature plants. And then, of course, he had to learn the art of plucking the tea and teach it to the women who were employed on the estate. But at least now there was knowledge in India, and so this knowledge would have transferred. He wasn't doing it on his own. What distinguished Taylor's experiment really was his ability not only to grow tea on a commercial scale, but he did actually master the processing of it. And he started practicing, it said, on his veranda at home. He rolled the leaves on the table by hand, he put them in clay ovens and all that sort of stuff. And he also managed to sort out how to do it. And this led to Taylor eventually beginning the operation of a fully fledged tea factory at the estate. He had a water wheel to supply power, and the most important thing was the rolling machine that he invented, as this was the essential part of the tea processing, crushing the leaves just to the right level to release the juices and enzymes that provide the flavour. And the first sale of this tea was made in Kandy in 1872. Now there's a recurring theme in my last couple of talks. This is not the actual packaging from then. You know, I said about the Capitan, it wasn't the first. This is not the actual packaging of them. There's nothing left in the archives to show us what the packaging was like. A year later, in 1873, the first shipment of Ceylon tea arrived for sale in London. But it was only £23 worth of tea, or 10 kilos. These pioneering efforts couldn't have been more timely because, of course, as you know, the coffee blight happened. And so that had begun in 1869, and it had begun to spread from estate to estate. Many of the people with the coffee faced financial ruin, and some returned home. So the rest actually soon realised that maybe tea could be their salvation, and the task of switching industries began in earnest. After the 1873 trial of sending his tea to London, which was declared a success, 2 years later, regular consignments began to be sent, and the first one was 653 kilos. So you can see how well the production has started to increase. 3 years later, Ceylon tea made its first big appearance at the London auctions from estates all over Ceylon, and from this time the export of tea from London grew and grew. This is a painting of a tea auction in London. And as the popularity of Ceylon tea began to grow, the need to consolidate the tea sales arose. And this led to the first public Colombo auction in 1883, which is now the world's oldest tea auction centre. And this is a picture from that time. 9 years later, James Taylor, after devoting 40 years to the production of tea on the estate, with only one break in all that, he only took one holiday, and that was the busman's holiday, as we say, because he went to Darjeeling to learn more about tea growing. He became a victim of his own success because the rapid growth of the industry meant that large companies started to take over, leaving the small planters like himself vulnerable. And he didn't actually live much longer to see the enormous success that he had started. He died in 1892. He was only 57 years old. What he didn't live to see was the Ceylon Tea Traders Association, which was formed 2 years after his death, which lasted for 125 years with a dual function as an organisation where everyone in the tea industry could get fair representation, and also as the custodian of the great Ceylon commercial institution, the Colombo tea auctions. At this time, another now famous name came onto the scene: Thomas Lipton. He came from a humble beginning, growing up in a tenement building in Glasgow. Another Scottish. The Scottish are very much involved in the Sri Lanka story. He would eventually become Sir Thomas Lipton, and a world-renowned entrepreneur. Just 16, Thomas had signed up as a cabin boy and sailed to the USA, where he had a series of jobs before returning to Scotland, where he set up a grocery store. So he did his sort of bit of youth, had a bit of fun, and then he came back to Scotland, set up a grocery store. His parents had been in that business, so he was probably familiar with them, and he took the grocery business, it's said, like a duck to water. One store soon became a chain of stores across Glasgow. This is one of his original shop fronts. And he sold the usual provisions in his shops. It's a grocery shop. But soon Lipton started to travel the world looking for new items to stock. And recognising tea was what everyone wanted. In 1888, he went to Ceylon and he bought his own tea plantation, which allowed him to sell tea at lower prices than his competitors because he had no middlemen to deal with. And at this time, tea would have been sold out of large tea chests and weighed out for the customers. And buyers had often no way of knowing if, one, the tea was fresh, if the seller was actually giving them the proper amount. So Lipton decided to sell tea in packets by the pound, the half pound and the quarter pound. And in the packets, of course, the tea would stay fresher. It was easy to handle. It'd be more attractive in these colourful, neat packaging, also with a catchy slogan. Now, slogans, really, this marketing issue wasn't there at the time, and he was quite early into the game because his slogan was, "Direct from the tea garden to the teapot." Now, that sounds really attractive, doesn't it? And this is a newspaper. Over 1 million packets sold weekly. The world is astounded at the marvellous value of Lipton's tea. So he was on a winner. He marketed it aggressively. And Lipton's tea were an immediate success. Here's more early packaging, you can see. And he even started to package it in tins, which will be great because people keep them and use them as a tea caddy then, don't they? And by 1927, tea production on the island had reached almost 100,000 metric tons, almost entirely for export. The humidity, the cool temperatures and the rainfall of the country's central highlands provided a climate that was so favourable to the production of high quality tea. And then on the 4th of February 1948, Ceylon was granted independence as the Dominion of Ceylon. And this status within the British Commonwealth was retained for the next 24 years, until the 22nd of May 1972, when it became a republic and was renamed the Republic of Sri Lanka. This is the handover ceremony of that event. And all through this period, Ceylon and then Sri Lanka have been one of the world's leading tea exporters. And by 1965, Sri Lanka had grown to become the world's largest tea exporter, the largest in the world. It had overshadowed China, and China had lost out because of the tea thefts that had been done. The first International Tea Convention was held in 1966 to commemorate 100 years of the tea industry, and in 2017 another to mark 150 years. So from an initial export of a mere £23, the production of tea had expanded really rapidly, and by the turn of the century, exports had risen to £151 million. So too did the glowing reputation of Ceylon tea, as the industry continued to flourish, moving into the 20th century. In 1980, Sri Lanka was the official supplier of the tea to Moscow's Summer Olympics, and in 1987 it was also the official supplier of tea at the Expo 88 in Australia. This is the Queen. I think she's opening it there. And still today, Ceylon tea is renowned worldwide for its high quality and unique flavours. And although the name of the country has changed to Sri Lanka, the tea continues to be marketed as Ceylon tea. And that's what we look for. If we want a good cup of tea, we look for Ceylon tea. It is the world's premium tea. Sri Lanka, with its cooler temperatures and all the perfect weather, is perfect for growing it. But also, and when the tea plants are fully grown, each leaf is picked by hand, which is not now common harvesting methods, as machinery is more often used, which of course when you've just got something going across the top of the tea plants, it runs the risk of picking up a coarser leaf. And the slogan now is the best from crop to cup. So very similar to what Lipton started, but it has been changed. But what about coffee? In the last 2 decades, coffee production in Sri Lanka has seen signs of revival, but it's a smaller crop than tea. But the country's history as a coffee producer and its favourable geographical conditions have set the stage for a resurgence in coffee farming. It's mainly the Arabica, which is the best coffee bean, the finest one, the smoothest one when you drink it. It's also the most expensive coffee bean. And although tea might still hold top spot as Sri Lanka's favourite hot drink, coffee is now becoming popular. In Colombo, you will see coffee shops that are buzzing with hordes of, shall we say, caffeine hunters, although you do get caffeine in tea as well, don't you? Because over the past decade or so, Sri Lanka's coffee culture has caught on. And has sprung up, giving growers the confidence to grow coffee for both the home market and for export. It seems like whether you're a tea drinker or a coffee drinker, Sri Lanka can provide both.